Four be converted to Darwinism. Marx, Stalin, Hitler, Mao Zedong all accepted Christian teaching that humans were all brothers, all descendants of Adam and Eve, and therefore, of course, this pretty well negated their racist ideas, because we're all brothers. And after they became communists, or in the case of Hitler, they then rejected this, accepted Darwinism. And Darwinism, it has to be racist because survival of the fittest. If we're all equal, there is no survival of the fittest because we're all equal. So we have to have differences. That's what basically the the Darwinian worldview works on. So it has to be weaknesses, has to be some superior, some inferior for evolution to work. And Engels, same thing. He was raised by a strict Bible-believing father. He started to question his faith. And Bruno Bauer at the University of Berlin was an important factor. And of course, a major factor that influenced liberal theologians was Darwin. And results, 77 million since Christ have been martyred, 45.5 in the last century alone. And this is from the World Christian Encyclopedia. And communism died as a result of communism and Nazism, about 167 million. Some people feel those numbers are very conservative. Millions more from disease, famine, and of course deaths from injuries. A lot of deaths from the war don't die during the war. They have some injury and they die 5 years later. I had a friend of mine who had a bullet in his neck. And I said, why don't they remove it? Well, they can't. It's right next to the spinal column. The concern is they remove it, I'm going to die, I'll be paralyzed. So they didn't remove it, and he later on died as a result of the movement of that bullet in his neck. So that would be a war casualty, but not listed as such. And Lenin, same thing, raised by devout Bible-believing parents. Around 1892, he discovered Darwin and Marx's writings, and of course changed the world forever. And there you can see a picture of Lenin. He developed a fascination with Charles Darwin, had a statue related to Darwin on his desk for many years. And Darwin became his new religion. And there you can see Stalin, the same thing. He was reared, in fact, he was going to seminary. And I think I mentioned that later, but he had an estimated 60 million humans murdered. And this is by a high-level Russian official who wrote this. And in seminary, he was a student. A friend of his said, a boyhood friend who I can't pronounce his name, but he said, Joseph, you know there's no God. And so Stalin, so-so, that's what they said in Germany, in Russia. I was astonished. How can you say such a thing? So-so. I'll lend you a book. It will show you that. Talks about all this talk about God is sheer nonsense. What book is that? Darwin. You must read it. And he, as a seminary student, finally left and, of course, became, as you know, an avid Darwinist. He abandoned his faith, began to tell his fellow seminarians that people were descendants from ape, not from Adam, and the rest is history. There you can see he's a good-looking young man. And these are an estimate of the fatalities, and you can see big numbers. Again, far, far greater than all the persons killed in the purges, etc., throughout all the previous 4,000 years. And again, you can see this is that statistic. Darwin wanted to murder God, and we talked about this, to destroy the reason people believe in God is the creation. Ota Benga is a good example of a pygmy who ended up in a zoo, and the concern was this is demeaning to our race. The black preachers primarily were concerned about what this was doing to their race. We have enough problems without this. But the other side said, look, you want proof of evolution? There you go. In a cage in Brooklyn zoo, there he is. How can you deny the fact of evolution when we have a person who is a missing link himself? And Julia Pastrana is another example. She was a Mexican digger woman, and she, by the way, looked like an ape, and you can see she had hirsutism, a disease where you have a hair pretty much all over your body. She also had a disease of the gums, which allowed her gums to protrude out. And she was the secretary to the governor of Mexico. Good job. She was fluent in 5 languages. And when the governor, kind of like here, when the governor lost his position, election, you know what happens, he lost his job, and of course she lost her job. And the problem is, what do you do for a living when you look like that? Well, this guy came along called Lenz, and Lenz said, we'll go on tour. We'll travel the world, and you can sing and dance, etc., and you will be the missing link. You'll prove evolution. And she, what option did she have? And so she went with him and traveled throughout Europe. And then, and the story gets interesting, she was getting like 10% of his income, and he was becoming rich. So some friends said to her, 10%? I mean, you're the show. Why doesn't he get 10%? You get 90%. I mean, you're the show. You're where how he makes his money. I'll tell you, you come to me and I'll give you 60%, I'll take 40. And then she went to Lenz and she said, I've got a really good offer from somebody else to do shows with him. And you tell me what happened next. Audiences can always guess this. Come on, what happened next? And the better offer was? 70-30. No. What? Married her. You got it. He married her. Okay? She got pregnant, and in Russia then she delivered the child, his child, and the child was born dead, and she died shortly after. And she died, she loved romance stories. She loved to read. She could read in 5 languages. Spanish, of course, English, and German, I believe. But she loved romance stories. And when she was on her deathbed, she said, I die knowing someone loved me for me. But after she died, he had her body stuffed, and that is her body stuffed. And he went around displaying her and continued to make the money from the display. But she wasn't alive anymore. She couldn't sing and dance. So it was harder to make a living, and but eventually body deteriorated where he couldn't display it. And we, of course, brag about America, but we don't have a history that's always very sterling. In fact, America and Nazi Germany were the only nations in the world that codified in their law racism. The only nations in the whole world. Now, South Africa didn't treat their blacks very well, that's true, but it wasn't codified. They didn't have extensive legal laws that basically eliminated association in many areas between blacks and whites. And it was illegal for a black to marry a white until, I think, 1967, when Loving was his name, and Loving versus the state of Pennsylvania. A white guy married this woman, black woman, and they had, I think, 3 children. And they got a jail sentence, and the judge said, this before they had children, the judge said, just leave the state. But he couldn't do that. He had to come. He had relatives. He had friends. So he came back and got in trouble, and then the ACLU does do some good things. I know it's rare, but this is one case. The ACLU said, we'll go to court and we'll try to negate all the laws, and there are 30 states that prohibited by law the marriage between blacks and whites. 30 states. We'll try to negate these laws, and they went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and they ruled the state cannot tell who you can and cannot marry. And so that was the first case that they basically used to negate all of the miscegenation laws. And that basically allowed blacks to marry whites. And now, as you probably know, it's an enormous number of black-white marriages. At the college where I teach, I know at least 24 of black-white marriages. So now it's becoming increasingly common, and of course that's what the racists were concerned about. That's what Hitler was concerned about. And this is a good example of the KKK and interesting history. Margaret Sanger, she charmed the black community's most distinguished leaders into accepting her plan, which was designed to their own detriment. What she wanted to do, and this is called the Negro Project, she wanted to reduce the birth rate among the sickly, poverty-stricken, etc., especially for the Negroes, and that's why most abortion clinics to this day are in black neighborhoods. Today it's still true, and most, I don't remember the number, but a highly disproportionate number of abortions take place among black women. And Margaret Sanger, she founded Planned Parenthood in 1916 to eliminate what she thought were the inferior races. Orientals, Jews, and blacks, so she had quite a list. She called these human weeds. And she also said, the most merciful thing that a large family does to one of its infant members is to kill it. So, and she neglected, by the way, horribly her own kids. And she died, I think, in 1963, alone, and depressed, destitute woman, which is tragic. And we don't want word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population. And here you can see is a list of the people she was concerned about sterilizing. And she was concerned the same thing about Hitler was, dysgenics, the deterioration of the race. And David Duke, it's interesting, he was raised as a young earth creationist, and he accepted this until he went to college. And in college, now this was, 30 years ago, in college he studied evolution and was convinced evolution was true. Therefore, there has to be differences in the races, and he became a racist after studying Darwinism. And I have a whole chapter on him in one of my books out there. And his chapter, my chapter summarizes his book, which basically is 250 pages proving of Darwinism. And he quotes from the leading Darwinists. Of course, many were older, but he quotes from the leading Darwinists basically saying that the races cannot be equal because evolution has nothing to select from. So therefore, racism is important, and Duke's whole focus and concern was degeneration of the race. And when people interview him, he'd say, I'm not a racist, I don't hate any groups, I'm just worried about the degeneration of the whites. Because our race is going to be degenerate. But of course, little genetics here, you probably know, if a black and a white marry, what is the concern about sickle cell anemia? Zero. Close to it. Okay? How about Tay-Sachs disease? Not a concern. Among Jews, primarily Jews and Caucasians. How about many other diseases? Why is that? Because many diseases are started by what they call the founder mutation, and those mutations are in a line so that if you marry your relative, the chances are greater you'll end up with that founder mutation than anybody else. Sickle cell anemia, they believe, only started by one person. So everybody who has sickle cell anemia is related to that one person. Now, some argue and say it was 3, but who cares? But I read the ones that said it was 3, but another article contradicted that and said, no, it's just 1. But anyways, so those who have sickle cell anemia, if you marry somebody that's a descendant from that founder mutation, then you're more likely to develop the anemia. There are 2 types of sickle disease. One is where you have the trait, which is usually not a problem. The other is where you have the disease. To have the disease, you have to have 2 defective genes for sickle cell anemia. And the only way you'll get that primarily is to marry somebody who is part of that line. And therefore, today, interracial marriages are clearly healthier. There's a whole line of diseases you won't have to worry about if you marry someone who's from a different area. I tell my students, you're a Caucasian girl, you need to marry a Japanese guy, or Chinese guy, or black guy. You'll have healthier kids as a whole. Have healthier kids. Darwin was worried about that a lot because he married his first cousin. So he was very concerned in his family that this would be a problem because at least back then he knew that. But so rather than degeneration of the race by marrying other races, if you want to reduce degeneration, you should marry people from other races. I'm sure my students don't think about that. Let's see, as a black guy, I think, let's see, we're less likely to have, what's the other disease, the lungs, where you end up, have to hit you on the back to get the cystic fibrosis, okay? You don't have to worry about cystic fibrosis. Girls don't think of that. But on the other hand, studies have shown that when a woman, well, you tell me if this is right, when a woman dates a guy, she is thinking about marriage material and what type of father will he be. Will he be a good father? Don't women think about that when they date a man? They think about how he treats children, if he likes children, if he would make a good father. Is that true? Do you think about that with your husband before you married? You observed him react to kids and you thought, good father, good marriage material.